Hey everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is part 2 of a multi-part series that covers character rigging in Blender. Today, I'm going to talk about the most commonly used rigging components that I use within my personal character rigs. So these are the things that I use on almost every rig that I make, at least for personal reasons. And I find them to be incredibly powerful when you combine them all together. So I have a series of different rigs that I'm going to show you. They're all using the same mesh here, as you can see. These are not properly finished arm rigs. They are just components of what could be an arm rig. So don't consider these to be completed examples on how to rig an arm. This is just a demonstration of the different tools you can use when rigging components such as an arm. So to begin with, we can start with the most simple thing out of the whole thing, and that is the forward kinematic, or the FK joint chain. And this is the most easiest thing to build in Blender when it comes to rigging. It's basically a single joint chain of bones that you control from the base outwards towards the extremities. So really simple stuff to rig. Yeah, and you basically, every rig has an FK joint chain involved in some degree. And you know, in some cases I may ignore this in the arms or legs, but you know, they do become useful in a lot of circumstances. The second, and I guess we're going in increasing levels of complexity here, we have the bing IK joint chain, which is the inverse kinematic joint chain, and that and that is basically what it says on the tin. It is the inverse of this. So starting from the hand and not from the base here, I can control the bend of the arm. And if you've done my introduction to rigging tutorial series in the past, you should know what these are, and you should know how to build them. They're pretty simple to set up, but you know, there is a second level of complexity here in that you have a secondary control to control the twist of the elbow. You have a control for the hand itself, and then you have a control for the you know, what would be the shoulders or the hips. But the cool thing about this setup is, of course, that you can do stuff like this. So imagine that we have a floor and you have a character doing a push-up. We can do something like that, where the hand stays put and the body can move up and down. So that's that one. The next one we're going to show is bing, the Bendy Bone system. And this one is a Blender exclusive, I guess you can call it. It's something that only exists in Blender. The Bendy Bone system is sort of like an auto Spline Ik system that lets you do cool stuff like this. Whoa, whoa, hey, noodle arms, really cool stuff like this. But it also allows you to bend it in 2 directions, so you can actually wrap this around if I wanted to in the around the other arm, which is really kind of weird. But there are limitations to this thing. For one of them is that you can't easily control the way that the curvature behaves. I mean, you have to rig it in though. So in the Deforming Bone, which I'll show you in a moment, you'd have to actually use drivers to drive the intensity of the curve, which can be a good and bad thing in some ways. But this stuff is really great for very easy to build noodle arms, great for facial expression rigs as well, if you don't want to deal with shape keys and all that sort of shit. The other advantage that you get that you don't automatically get out of, say, an IK or FK chain, so let's just jump back into this guy and fix those up. The things you don't get out of these, so let's just enable all of these as a editable rig. You don't automatically get a wrist twist or some sort of twisting action down the joint chain in the reverse with any of these. Like eventually they'll just crush if you overextend them. Whereas with a the Bendy Bone system, you can actually rig it up so it inherits some level of twist, which is super useful. There is one limitation though. It can only twist up until 180 degrees in the Y before things start to break. So watch this. Up to 180 degrees and break. So there are limitations to this, but for 90% of rigs, this is definitely more than enough when it comes to doing like forearm twists and stuff like that, especially for more, I guess you can say, realistic level of deformation. But again, this is really great for expression, for facial rigs, really great for quick and easy noodle arms, great for spines and necks as well. So you'll see me cover that in my tutorials when it comes to doing that sort of stuff. And then finally, which I think is a feature or a constraint that is criminally underused in Blender, and that is the Spline Ik system in Blender. And the Spline Ik system is basically a more manually built version of the Bendy Bone system, whereas the Bendy Bone system, you kind of procedurally add subdivisions to a single deforming joint. This one has many pre-subdivided joints that you have to rig up. But the cool thing about the Spline Ik system is that it gives you flexibility of the curve. So look how you can actually manipulate the location of the curvature along the spline. Sorry. So unlike the Bendy Bone system, which kind of gives you just two points of articulation, this one effectively gives you 3. And you could rig multiple bendy bones together to get this sort of level of deformation, but you won't get this sliding action that you get with the Spline Ik. The other cool thing as well, because you're working with splines as an underlying deformer, you can also change the way it behaves with this Bezier handle. So you get instant deformation of the curvature of the bone chain down the arm, depending on how you've rigged it up. So, and you know, this is probably the more complicated sort of thing to build, but it is very satisfying when it works. And the other thing that this thing doesn't have out of the box is that wrist twist. So you don't get that twisting action that the Bendy Bone provides you. So you actually have to manually put that into the joint chain with either drivers or a constraint system. So there are some pros and cons for every one of these different functionalities, but when you combine them together, you can create some really powerful stuff. So let's check out an example with my Eevee rig. So let me open that up. So here's Eevee. Let me just shrink that down. And you can see that it's quite a complicated little rig here, but you get the combination of all of them working in tandem with one another. So let's see. So we have our IK chain manipulating the arms. Really cool stuff. Let me just give you an idea of what's going on. And you can see how that's working with the toon shader. You got the IK working there. And then if we, you know, obviously with most rigs, you have an FK IK switch. So in the settings here, I can switch it into an FK setup here, where you have that forward kinematic sort of motion going on there. And then for like the arms themselves, I'm using Spline IKs to manipulate those two knee arms to work together. And then, for example, for the neck, I'm using Bendy Bones. So I'm actually using a Bendy Bone system there to allow me to do, you know, basic neck movements in a fairly simple fashion. And then finally, with the Bendy Bones as well, I'm also using it for the eyebrows. So here's a cool thing. And it works with, here's the amazing thing, it works with grease pencil objects, which is also amazing to see. Check that shit out, amazing. All right. So this is a quick little demo of what's going on there, and you can see here, even with the spine, I'm using a Spline Ik, not using Bendy Bones here, but I've rigged it up in a way that allows me to get that twist in there. So I've manually built that into the joint chain there. And we'll talk about that in another video. But as a demo, that's just showing you how all these different components or different ways of rigging and combining them together will give you a very powerful rig to work with. All right, let's jump back into my original setup here. All right, let's see what's going on under the hood for all of these rigs. So let's just go to our layer settings here and turn on all the underlying deformation layers. So, all right, let's turn off the wireframe there and bring up the wired view for all of these joints here. Okay, so looking at this setup here, you'll see there's a few differences. So, if you've looked at my previous videos on rigging, it's always a good idea to have a deforming joint chain that is driven by your actual control. So I've done that throughout my setups here. So I only have my deforming joints doing the deforming. They aren't doing any controlling. They're actually just being driven by the controllers. So, classic sort of setup here, 3 joints, one for the hand, one for the forearm, one for the bicep, and they're being driven by their respective controllers. Very simple sort of stuff with a very basic copy transforms input for each of those deforming joints. Again, with the IK, it's the same thing, except this time instead of being driven by, the FK joint chain, the deforming joints here are being driven by the IK constraint. Same joint chain though, same deforming, same weight paints, everything like that. It's all the same thing, just a different functionality working the bones basically. Okay, this one's a little bit more interesting. The bendy bone is actually, let's just jump out of that, go into our other bone here. You may look at this and think, oh wait, there's like 10 joints there, or 10 bones, what's going on? What the actual fact is, it's only one. There's only one joint chain there. So if we go into our bone settings for this particular thing, and go to our bendy bones, you'll see that bendy bones actually subdivides a single joint chain. So if we go to our octahedral settings here, and then we switch over to our bendy bones settings here, and I increase the number, the actual bone itself isn't changing. It's only when we switch it over into the viewport display of bendy bones that you actually see that subdivision happening. And unlike the FK and IK controls, this setup is a little bit different in that it needs 2 driving components that dictate the inheritance of the bone roll for the controllers, and then those controllers are children of the ultimate controllers, which are these master controllers for the hand and the base there. And then finally we have our Spline Ik, which is a bit more complicated. So the Spline Ik actually does use a actual spline to drive the deformation of our joints. So if we go into isolation view, for instance, you'll see that there's actually a spline that's being driven by the armature, which in turn is also driving the deformation joints. So we will talk about how that's set up in a bit more detail in a few minutes, but basically what we end up getting is the spline itself driving the behavior of our joint chain, and in this case the joints are actually subdivided joints. If I wanted to have even more sort of finesse in the curvature of this joint chain here, all I would have to do is subdivide this joint chain even more. So if I want it to be even smoother in its deformation, I just have to subdivide these. For instance, let me just give you an example. subdivide that. And then we have to fix up the constraint to be 16 in this case. But the Spline Ik still works. And if we were to reskin this with automatic weights, you will see that it will still behave in the same fashion, which is pretty cool. So the difference here is that the spline itself is being driven by the controllers. So the spline is effectively hooked or parented to these three controllers according to the spline itself. So the spline has, or the Bezier curve, let me just click on that. Let's get out of local view. So you see the Bezier curve has 3 points on the Beziers, and then those points are effectively hooked up to the controllers, which then drives the spline, which then drives the deformation of the joint chain. Bit complicated, a lot more complicated than the rest, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. Okay, but before we wrap up with this demonstration, we need to talk about exportability into a game engine setting, because a few of you have talked about how you want to create game engine rigs and how you want to export animation into the like Unity or Unreal. So we need to talk about what's compatible and what's not. So firstly, your FK and IK, you should have 0 issues. It should be perfectly fine to export these as animation. However, with Bendy Bone, this guy is a no-no. Do not use Bendy Bones on your game engine rigs. They do not work. It's a Blender centric feature. It's a deformer. It will not work. Again, do not use Bendy Bones, please. Okay. However, with the Spline Ik, if you want to get cartoony style animation, you can do it, but there is a requirement in terms of a workaround. So here's some sample animation that I've made for everything, so you can see what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to export all these animations as a FBX, and we're going to see what works and what doesn't. So the only thing I want to mention is that with the Spline Ik, in order to make it work, you need to have a secondary deforming rig controlling the hand or arm that is constrained. Each joint is an individual joint. They're not parented to one another. It's just a free joint, and they're basically just constrained with a copy transform with the appropriate joint in the IK chain. So be aware that you have to organize it in that sense, and we'll talk about that more in the future. But it's worth noting, if you want to do cartoony rigs, it is possible. You just got to use a Spline Ik, and you have to build it in such a fashion that you have a deforming joint chain constrained to the Spline Ik, and that's the only way it will export properly. Okay, so let's have a go. Let's export these. So I'm going to select everything. I'm going to go to Export FBX. I'm going to have it set to Armature and Mesh, Bake Animation, set it to all bones, NLA strips, all that sort of stuff. And we'll set it to Armature, only deform bones, add leaf bones, all that sort of shit. That's all good to go. And let's try this out. So we're going to export this FBX and see what happens. So let it think. All right, it's done that. So quick review, we got a little bit of arm bends in this. We have a little bit of elbow wiggle in the IK there. So that's all good. We have a lot of bendiness into the bendy bones. So be aware of that. That's the third one. And then we have the Spline Ik. So let's give that a go and have a look at this in an FBX previewer. Okay, so we have all of our rigs here with the appropriate colors apparently. So nothing's happening at the moment. We just got to choose the right armature action. So in the FK, yep, that's working perfectly well. In the IK, there we go. We've got the elbow wiggle as well. That's working well. Let's check out the Bendy Bone Rig. Uh-oh, does not bend. Mind you, again, let's review. That's how it's meant to look, and it's not working. Now, finally, with the Spline Ik, let's give that a go. Hopefully that works, and Ah, working pretty good. The Spline Ik wins when it comes to cartoony rigs in a game engine setting. So if you're going to use cartoony stuff, you may have to go with the Spline Ik option over the Bendy Bone. But if you're working within Blender on its own, stick to Bendy Bones if you want, or you can use the Spline Ik in tandem. So it's up to you. But be aware, Bendy Bones do not work in a game engine. So how do we build all of these things? Well, I'm going to show you. So stick around for that. In the next video, we'll go through the process on how to make every one of these different things. So we're going to talk about the FK, the IK, the Bendy Bone, and the Spline Ik in the next video. So part 2, part B. All right. Until then, catch us and have fun.